Abuse Services underspent their regular general fund, or general assistance appropriation, and their care and keep appropriation by about 2.1. And the Substance Abuse Services appropriation was underspent by 900,000. The majority of that is for the resource center that we keep appropriating, and I think we're finally gonna get there this fiscal year. We did have some revenue come in higher than anticipated. Mostly that was interest earnings, about $4 million more than what was budgeted. However, because it's kind of cyclical with recording fees, we did see a decrease in recording fees of about 800,000. Additionally, we did have additional money coming in for service of civil papers revenue of about 1.5. And we did receive 3.9 million for the opioid settlement funds that's sitting aside in a separate reserve fund. Its use is quite restricted, so we're still working through how to expend those funds. So what you'll see in this amendment is carrying forward expenditures to spend those funds that we did not spend last year. So about 94 million of increased expense compared to what we budgeted. Again, that's just carrying it forward from the prior fiscal year. And also the FEMA reimbursements of 2 million. So the second part here, the other amendments, is what I really call the substance of this amendment. Here are the things that we're actually changing compared to what we had budgeted. About $945,000 increase in autopsy expense for autopsies performed by the state. Now this includes cleaning up the last fiscal year as well. There's some invoices that simply, just for the timing and the turnover, they have not all been paid yet. And
so we've spent almost $1 million on autopsies this year because we haven't had a medical examiner?
That's projected expense. Year to date, we've spent about $250,000. So projecting out on the trend, we're estimating $950,000. And again, that includes cleaning up some of those invoices from last year because yes, we did not have a medical examiner. Now, in contrast to that, there were savings on salaries. We did save at least $400,000 on personal services compared to what we would have spent otherwise. So there is some trade-off there. We are requesting an increase for jail food and supplies purely because of inflationary expenditures, about $350,000 increase there. Oh, it's actually $250,000 there. And then $100,000 of it is for service of civil papers, just increased costs for fuel and postage. There was increased revenue coming in. There's also some costs associated with that. And then we are adjusting the mental health IDDD utilization budget in order to align with the available fund balances. Eliminating $700,000 appropriation for COVID-19. These were the items that we had been charging to FEMA. Is no longer eligible to use for FEMA is no longer reimbursing us for those programs, so we're simply getting rid of that appropriation. And then $600,000 increase to carry forward unexpended community betterment grants, as well as an increase for sponsorships. The other significant items that we do anticipate bonds to be issued in the spring for some housing programs and capital projects. I've incorporated those into the budget as well.
So Deb, with respect to the jail food supplies, it said at $250,000. Is that fairly typical per year, or is that just because of the inflationary pressure we're under right now?
You know, I would say that's not typical. Typically, we would see it if there were an increase in population. This one is more representative of the increased cost of food, and it does align with what they actually expended last fiscal year. But yeah, I believe it's inflationary.
Right.
Okay, so the remaining steps are next week I'll have a resolution on asking you to authorize publication of a public hearing. That public hearing would be on October 3rd, and then we'll move on to 24-25. Any questions?
Deb, just one question on the money that was retained from ARPA that moved over to the general fund. How much of that money is obligated or unobligated in terms of what moved over? Because I know there was some double counting of ARPA dollars.
It's all accounted for. So we moved over about $50 million for lost revenue replacement. We've set that aside in a separate account code, so we can track that. Last year we actually expended about 13 million of it for the 4 purposes that the board identified, and then the 37 million remaining is budgeted to be expended for mental health, affordable housing, economic well-being, and water quality. So all of it everything we moved over would be expended for those original purposes that the board identified for ARPA.
Okay.
And everything's accounted for.
Okay, but was there wasn't there a tranche of money that reimbursed the county for expenses that were already paid? That,
Oh, except the first, oh, you're talking about the very first one?
yeah, that then wasn't restricted from a ARPA guideline standpoint?
I know what you're asking about. I haven't reconciled that one because we did not set that aside in a separate portion. It was the first, yeah, it was the initial 24. I know that we used a portion of it actually to give funding to that event center.
Yeah,
I
that's
can't
fine.
answer your question right
I'd like
now.
just some follow-up on that.
Okay.
Anything else for Deb? Okay. Thanks, Deb. Next up, Tim and Brian, looks like.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm Brian Mulcahy from the Des Moines Airport Authority. I'm the Assistant Executive Director. I'm joined by Kevin Foley, our Executive Director, Jake Christensen, who's our Board Chair, and John Burmeister is our Municipal Advisor at the airport. So I'm here today to ask, to request that the supervisors pass or authorize a referendum for Polk County to sell bonds next year and authorize up to $350 million of bonds in the future that would be used for the Des Moines Airport Authority terminal. That money would be loaned to the authority and repaid by the authority so that we can achieve the lowest cost of capital for this project. Just an overview of the project itself. Phase 1A is the white building on the top. The white building below that is the parking garage expansion that's currently being built. That's 1,100 stalls that will be finished at the end of 2024. The white building above that is the main terminal processor. That's where we really have the pinch points. It will be connected to the existing concourses. Presently, we have the 12 gates on the existing concourses that would stay put. This next slide is just the full build-out of the eventual terminal. Eventually, we could get 22 gates on this site. Phase 1 is in the middle. The next phase would be another 3 or 4 gates to the right towards Fleur Drive. And then finally, the last phase would be the final 11 gates to the left of the page. And in order to build that, there's a lot of phasing because we would obviously have to take down the C concourse before we built that phase. So before I go any further, I do want to recognize the support that the supervisors, about 18 months ago I was here and you approved some ARPA money to help us with this project. Kind of helped us kickstart the drive at the time. We wound up getting support from 20 municipalities and counties, almost every municipality in Polk County, and a couple in Jasper and Warren County as well. So we appreciate that support, and that's amounted to approximately $32 million between all these 20 municipalities and counties, and then Prairie Meadows as well. So why are we doing this project? It's really all about capacity right now. The terminal processor is really not built to support the level of traffic that we have today. We are also very constrained on aircraft parking. Tonight, every day today, we have 20 or so aircraft parked around the terminal building, and that's all we can fit. So we're really constraining the opportunity to bring in new entrants into the market, or even for the existing airlines to expand. This project will replace a 70-year-old building, and that building has served its useful life. It's probably not going to serve us forever. It's definitely not going to serve the passenger counts that we expect to have in the future. Timeline, some milestones here on our project. Key ones, we've already accepted we've had a couple bid packages go out, accepted one. The second one is in the process of being reviewed now. So the project is moving forward. We'll start some utility work this fall, and major construction starts next April. 60% design in November of this year will be completed. And then the referendum, obviously, if approved by the supervisors, that would happen on November 7th. Assuming that's a positive outcome for us, then we would look at selling bonds probably we would need the money probably in about the summer of next year, and according to our construction cash flow. So we're estimating, approximately $100 million for that first bond sale, and then we would sell bonds again probably in 2025 as construction needs dictate and as the market conditions dictate. August 2024, is kind of a key point. That's all terminal bid packages will be received. And at that point, we really have cost certainty on the project because this is a progressive GMP. So we'll be able to set that gross maximum price at that point and know what we're going to pay for the building. So we are taking advantage of the state's new construction management at risk law for this project. White's Turner is our contractor, the joint venture. As I said before, we'll set that final GMP in the fall of 2024. And the legislation for CMAR has provided some benefits that we're seeing already. One is we're able to pre-qualify subcontractors. So we have to take low bids. So we want to know that everyone that's bidding is really a qualified subcontractor. And that White's Turner has run that process for us so far. It also helps us know that when we go out to bid, we're going to have a bidder pool, more than just one bidder out there that's going to bid on these projects. So far for the first couple bids, that seems to be working well, and we expect that to continue. Once we get into construction, we will have construction oversight managed by HNTB, who's our architecture firm, and then Answer Advisory, who's our owner's representative. Construction oversight is something we're very familiar with. We do it on all of our federal projects, but essentially this is eyes and ears on the project to know that everything that we're paying in a pay application has either been constructed or it's equipment that we've had to order. It's basically a way for us to tie back every line item in a bid or in a pay application to the funding stream that is associated with it. We have a lot of different funding streams, which I'll get into. So this construction oversight is going to be a critical step for us so that when we get audited on the back end for all this federal money and potentially state money, we're able to know that we're in good shape. As you're probably aware, the authority board approved a budget of $445 million for phase 1A in July. And that's based on the estimates that we've been developing throughout design. We had a 10% design estimate at this point when the budget was developed, but we felt pretty good about where we were at. Since then, we've gotten a 30% drawings completed, and we're in the process now of working through that estimate. And as we get results from those estimating exercises, then we will value engineer if we need to make sure we're staying reasonably close to budget. We do have some contingencies in the budget, and we feel comfortable about where those are placed right now. Contractor has approximately a 5%, and the owner has about an 8% contingency right now that we think that's the appropriate level for where we are in design. So as I mentioned before, there's a number of funding streams that we're working with. The financing for this is very complex because of all those funding streams. They each have their own requirements. A lot of the federal funding has a Build America, Buy American requirement to it. Our own passenger facility charges are a separate program through the FAA that we have to make sure we meet certain criteria. So the purpose of part of that construction oversight is also tracking every dollar to every bid package to know that if this federal money was spent on this piece of the project, then it's meeting all the requirements that have to be met. We did consider some other funding mechanisms for this project over the last 5 years. Public-private partnerships was one of those. We looked at, really dug into what that would mean. What we found was that through our due diligence was that really we were either going to have to give up an operating asset to pay the investor, something like parking, you turn over parking and they can run that and make money, or the cost of capital was going to be much higher than what we could borrow at ourselves. So we did not go the 3P route. General aviation revenue bonds is another, that's the typical airport financing mechanism. So if we were to issue those bonds ourselves, they would be, we call them GARBs, and then all of our funding, all of our revenue streams would be pledged to repay those bonds. I think you've all seen this slide before, but we just wanted to bring this back up and go over it again. We are still showing a $69 million funding gap, but the way that funding gap is calculated is that top line, the 296, really keeps the cost per employment for the airlines at what we believe to be a competitive cost per employment for us. If we have to bond, if we have to fill that $69 million gap ourselves, we'll do that through the bonding, and that's kind of how we get to the $350 million request in front of you. But the other funding streams there are all various, mostly federal, but other pieces that will go into this. Those all have their own requirements, as I discussed before. Ultimately, we will continue to work on filling that gap with other opportunities out there. Right now, we're about to apply for the RIF that was passed at the state legislature. There was a $10 million bill passed at the state legislature in last session, so we're applying for that. We're still working with the TSA on some funding for the bag system in the terminal. Typically, the TSA will pay some of that. We just don't know how much yet. And then there's also 3 more years of airport terminal program opportunity with the FAA that we'll be applying for. That next application will probably, the application, the notice of funding opportunity will be out any day for that. So we feel good opportunities to continue to chip away at this funding gap. And then, as I said, we'll bond what's needed to finish the project from there. Ultimately, the opportunity to have general obligation debt through the county really represents the lowest cost of capital for this project. The authority has a very strong financial position. When we had debt, we had an A2 rating with Moody's, which was actually pretty strong for a small hub airport. Since the airport became an authority, we've increased our reserves to about $100 million. We've also, during that time, completed about $75 million of enabling projects that the authority paid for. So we do have a very good operating model, and we feel confident that we have the finances available to repay the debt to the county. It's just that if the county does this, then obviously we're going to pay a lot less in debt service over that period of repaying all the debt. So it really is the lowest cost of capital. Between now and the time that debt would be issued, we would work with bond attorneys and municipal advisors to come up with the loan agreement between the county and the authority. Obviously, if we go out and sell debt, we're going to have bond covenants. The loan agreement would be similar to those covenants to make sure that the county is comfortable that you're protected and you have all the rights that you need in the agreement. Prior to bonding, we'll also conduct a financial feasibility study. That's a step that all airports take before they issue debt. Basically, an independent financial advisor that's familiar with the airport industry would come in and review our model to ensure that our assumptions, our projections, all of our calculations are accurate and reasonable, and essentially give you an opinion that we can repay this debt that we're asking the county to take on.
And when would that be done, Brian?
We can do it any time before the
Issuance of...
the issuance.
Okay.
It's probably going to take 2 to 3 months to complete, and really the longer we wait, the better, just because that gives us more actual data to plug into the model, and we're giving them if we can complete this year, 2023, they can see where our employments were for the year, they can see what our expenses were for the year, and basically where our cash position sits as we go into next year. So I would say if we started that in January, early February timeframe, that'd probably be a good time. We'd also have to work with the county to see what the timing of the borrowing is for next year to make sure we get it done in time. So ultimately, why would you decide to do this? Really, I think it's all about a few things here: protecting the $750 million impact of the Des Moines Airport Authority on Central Iowa. Everybody wants to have a vibrant, growing airport, and it's a key economic tool. Another one is the 50% increase in gate capacity. As I mentioned before, we're constricted now, and this will give us some breathing room to grow into the future. Positioning the airport to be able to go out and really try to attract more service is important, because more service means more competition. More competition means generally lower fares for everybody that's buying a ticket out of Des Moines. So that winds up being a very good thing. So again, I'll just reiterate what the request is. We're requesting that the supervisors approve a referendum to sell bonds from the county and loan that money to the airport authority to be repaid by the airport authority so that we can achieve the lowest cost of capital on this project. That's my last slide. I know Tim's going to present as well, so I can take questions now or after Tim's complete.
Questions for Brian, anybody? Okay.
Melissa, can I have the Kleenex box? Thanks.
Do I set it to full? It's not, oh, there we go. But so Brian went over the request to you. I'll get to what's at stake here in a little bit. To point out the obvious, they're hoping to use your excellent credit, your AAA rating, to the benefit of the authority, which will lower their interest cost. Lowering the interest cost lowers the cost per employment that you and I and all of our patrons in the greater community will pay as we come and go from the airport. So the Airport Authority is Iowa Code Chapter 330A. The city created it. The city's the member of the authority. The city appoints their 5-member board. The chair's sitting here with us today. My understanding, the way that statute's written and the organizing documents, the city cannot withdraw from the authority if there's debt outstanding. So the authority would continue to exist once the debt's taken on. City, as part of that creation now 12 years ago, the city transferred the assets to the authority. The land transferred via a real estate lease agreement, and then the other assets, staff, reserve funds, things like that, transferred pursuant to a separate assignment agreement. And those agreements, I understand, would remain in place today and would continue. The authority, the lease agreement goes through the year 2110. I'm looking forward to seeing all of us there when it terminates.
Great.
So I've kind of thought through a little bit about the loan itself from the county to the authority. I've shared some thoughts with the authority's advisor, but they're very rough thoughts. They're not demands. They're just discussion points for right now. But to kind of go over some of the key items. Right now, I understand the authority is debt-free, so this would be the only debt of the authority. That would not preclude them from taking on other debt. Let's say, for example, if they went on to Phase 1B, after successful completion of 1A, they would be allowed to do that subject to certain constraints. And Brian mentioned, and I would agree with Brian, that the constraints that we would expect to see would be those that we would typically see if the authority went and borrowed money in the bond market on their own. So I wouldn't think that we would ask for anything less stringent than what they would otherwise expect, nor would I think we would ask for anything more stringent than what they'd expect. Typical requirements for that type of debt would be a reserve fund, 1 year's payment. In this case, I indicate maybe some restrictions on mortgaging assets. I don't think the authority can legally mortgage assets, but I have not talked to your lawyer specifically about that. So if they cannot mortgage, I just want maybe a simple statement that they can't mortgage or something like that, so as to not allow a future lender to step in front of the county on a security interest in the property. No claim or no additional debt that would have a priority claim over the county. You know, you'd be highest in line. Now there might be others that share your place in the pecking order, but you'd be highest. We'd also allow for subordinate debt, so if somebody was willing to lend to the authority and the authority wanted to borrow it on a junior lien basis, they would be allowed to do so. Doing okay so far? Okay. Let's see, so my open issues are, so the model creates a fair amount of surplus cash. Now the model makes, operating assumptions, and the authority has over the years created cash and then used the cash to pay for capital improvement items. On one hand, you might say, well, we should grab all of the cash and pay this loan down early. On the other hand, but that would tend to push the authority to where they would have to borrow money for their capital improvements. And I'm thinking of kind of the run-of-the-mill stuff that right now they pay cash for. And that's why I'm uncomfortable with the idea that you just grab every dollar and leave them then to have to go borrow for the next thing. I'm not sure we're accomplishing the goal. So what we have to work through, and I don't have today a solution, but what we have to work through with the authority is what's the right amount of cash that they need year in and year out for, I call it stuff. And after that amount they have, then what amount is of what's left do we say, all right, let's use that surplus to prepay this loan? We just have to work through and find common ground there. And we have not started that kind of discussion. So, doing okay?
Tim, I got a question for you. On
Please.
the 30-year amortization you talk about in here, obviously we can't do that. We have to
Correct.
do 20s, but I've seen these balloon payments come in a lot of different aspects of, over the years. And everybody feels good about it. The start of the loan amortization, then we get the balloon payments, like, oh my God, what are we gonna do? Would this be a situation where the balloon payment would then be refinanced for another 10 years, something like that? Would you
Correct.
anticipate? Okay, so it's not really gonna be a balloon payment.
Yeah, so, and the other thing to remember is that brings into the discussion what our industry calls the call feature, or what you call the optional ability to pay the loan off early. Typically on a bond like this, the 20-year bond would be prepayable sometime after the 8th, 9th, 10th year. So we have the intent of the 30-year amort 20-year bond is that will leave us with at least a 10-year window when we can refinance the balloon payment, stretch it out 10 more years. Does that make sense, or have I lost it?
I understand.
Okay. So I don't think the intent is to just, well, when we get to the balloon payment, nobody knows what to do next. I think the authority's been talking a lot about, well, we want to refinance at the first possible date we can to lock that in as well for them.
Right. Thanks.
Okay, so to point out the risks, you would be lending to the airport, and the airport's arguably a cyclical business. There are factors that can affect usage. demand for air travel, environmental issues that might affect airline usage from year to year. The cost per enplanement could, if it were to get high, it might incent airlines to not want to be here. Demographic trends, et cetera. These are all typical business risks that the airport bears from time to time. Recession, depression, pandemic obviously affects airport usage as well, and we just went through and watched that happen here a few years ago. The counties, if we would anticipate that the county's GO bond rating is likely to go down one notch, maybe 2 notches at the most, because of the size of the amount that's being borrowed relative to the Moody's metrics. There's probably a threshold where the rating doesn't go down. We've estimated that, and I realize this is a wide estimate, but somewhere between 100 and 200 million. But at 350, when we calculate it out, the rating does tend to fall into the AA category as opposed to in the AAA.
Tim, how often do they do those ratings? So I guess my question's more around the idea that it sounds pretty clear that our bond rating is going to drop down at least 1 notch to the discussions that we've had.
Yeah.
Can you talk, well, number one,
Sure.
when would and how would it go back up? I assume when you get some of that debt paid down, it would go back up to the AAA bond rating. So, and what are the ramifications long-term for the county if it does decrease that one step, or just ballpark?
Yeah. So there's an open question in my mind as to when it happens. Brian hinted at maybe we borrow 100 million next summer and arguably then, 250 the following year. Would the rating agency take the action at the first 100 million? Would they wait till to 2025? And I don't have a great answer for that. My gut tells me, out of big caution, we better assume that they'll take action at the earliest date, because we're going to tell the rating agency next summer, we're borrowing 100 today, but we have to borrow 250 more tomorrow. And so, they're going to, I think, factor the whole thing in. I think that's the assumption we should make. Ratings are updated annually. Typically, you're in many of the years in the past, you've been in the market annually, so the rating is updated when you're ready to borrow. And for the next couple of years, I anticipate that'll be the case. But longer term, if you're not in the market in any given year, they'll still have to do an annual update of the rating. And yes, I think the point you're getting at, if the debt pushes us above the threshold and pushes the rating down, then the converse would also be true. At some point in time, the debt will have come down and we will be back into that AAA threshold. And they would, in theory, move the rating at that point in time. In my experience, the rating agencies are maybe a little quick on one side and a little slower on the other. I'll let you guess as to which is which. So,
Tim, you may have been in high school back when we did this, but we did Iowa Event Center. Did we see a decrease in our bond rating after that?
You did not. Thank you for the compliment, by the way.
Last one you're getting.
So the county's rating had some up and downs when Prairie Meadows was opened, and if you'll recall, all of the stuff that went around the Prairie Meadows default. But once Prairie Meadows was stabilized with the gaming, et cetera, the county's rating has stayed at the AAA threshold since then. So when you built Wells Fargo, when you remodeled Vets Auditorium, even when we built the Hilton, all of those things were, 100 million-ish type numbers, and that they didn't cause the rating to change.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, thanks.
So Brian mentioned the financial model. I have played around a little bit with it, and kind of tried to stress test, you know, what happens if you reduce employments by a certain amount. What I found from playing around with the model is that if you stress test, if you lower utilization by 15%, the airport generates, cost per employment goes up to about $21. It has the airport generates cash equal to 1.5 times the annual debt service. They'd have surplus cash of about $10 million. And if you stress test that further from 15% down to 25%, they still generate cash, drops from 10 down to $8 million a year. So you have to push utilization pretty hard before we're getting to where, according to the model, before we're getting to where the airport would be tight to cover debt service. When they last sold bonds, the airport adopted a resolution that provided for what I call a waterfall, but it's kind of how does the money move through the airport. Operating costs, of course, first, debt service second, reserves, subordinate debt service, and then surplus dollars. And to remind you, federal law requires surplus to stay at the airport. Now, it can be used to pay debt, but it has to stay. It can't be transferred to the city, for example. So I envision a document that looks very similar to that. In terms of cost, how much cheaper is this for the airport authority? We made certain assumptions in building a model, and I didn't lean on the county's bond attorney for guidance about how much of this is taxable versus subject to the alternative minimum tax. I just made an assumption that it was roughly 50-50. And in doing that, we then used the current market rates indexes. Assume that 100 million would be borrowed next year and the balance 250 in summer of 2025. Start paying principal in 26 with, and I need to verify that closer as the airport models out its construction. There are certain things they cannot pay for until the airport's actually put in service. So we need to make sure that the first payment on principal on the debt coincides with when the airport is actually available to be used, the new terminal. And when I calculate that through over the 30 years, I come up with savings to the authority of about 76 million. Adjusting that back to today's dollars, that's about 47 million in today's dollars. Now, to remind you, that just is simply going to flow through to a reduction in the cost per employment. They're not going to create 76 million of additional cash. They're going to ask for 76 million less money from the airlines and you and I as customers over that time period.
That is a key talking point.
Correct. Now, I'm sure somebody could build a different model, by the way. These are just my assumptions in preparing for this, so.
Is that that's the total amount of savings for the whole bond,
Correct.
right?
Correct.
Okay.
And when you assumed we're going to refinance at that last 10-year mark or whenever the balloon payment would come due, what rate did you assume that the refinance would be?
So my crystal ball broke, so I tend to, what I did is say, we'll have the same, it's a 10-year period, so we'll have the same 10-year rates at that time that we have today.
Yeah, okay.
So just as something we can defend as in terms of the basis of the calculation.
That.
So, and then cost per employment for every $1 million reduction is a 33-cent reduction in the cost per employment. And if I'm going to get this right, employment is a out and back. Did I say that wrong? Okay,
It's the difference between claimants and passengers.
okay. Brian talked a little bit about the management letter. I agree that it probably makes sense to not ask for that today. Let's let the fiscal year run its course and then work on that. We'll have an opportunity to talk about that with you again in the spring before we borrow the money. I did want to address one question that I didn't type up in here. You know, when will we borrow the money? This 100 million / 250 million, these are reasonable but guesses at the moment. And, you know, they're not 50% through their design docs. You saw the timeline, they'll be 60% through in the early part of the year. And each time they get through, I expect that part of what they'll get out of that is better understanding as to when they need money and how much. And so it may be that, well, I think we will need to be flexible to make sure that they get the funding they need on their timeline, if the voters say yes and if you say yes. So I don't want you to view this as 100 and, you know, the balance a year later. We may need to move around a little bit based on their needs. So I've seen the management letter from the last time they borrowed, which is a long time ago, 12 years or so, and fully understand it's a pretty good feasibility analysis of the facility, and I anticipate that's what this one will look like when it comes. Last item I have, and then I'll entertain any questions, is the real estate lease. The city transferred the real estate to the authority under a lease, and then that lease expires in 2110. The 2010 bonds, the city agreed to subordinate the lease to those bonds. That would, in English, that means the city can't foreclose on and take the land back from the authority when there's debt outstanding. The resolution specifically mentioned the 2010 bonds. It's not clear to me that means that these bonds would be above and the lease would be subordinated, or that these bonds would fall subordinate to the lease, but I would expect that we will need to resolve that question. My take or my guidance to you would be you don't want the city to be able to foreclose on the lease while you have loans outstanding to the authority. So we just have to work through with legal and make sure that gets addressed. So what questions can I answer?
The city, somebody say the city appoints the board?
I said that, yeah.
Okay. So all 5 members, the city appoints? And that's the only authority they really have, is appointing the board?
Correct. They have to be residents of the city of Des Moines. I think the mayor the mayor nominates and the council affirms it, but that's where the board members come from. We have 5.
Okay. Well, Polk County should play a role of some sort if we decide to do this. I'm not sure how or why or any of that, but somehow we should have some role in the Des Moines International Airport. I know it can't be called Polk County International Airport, but we're going to do something if you want us to move this forward. That's the way I see
You're talking
it.
at the board level, you mean?
Yeah.
At the board level or some type of.
Advisory, I don't know,
Yeah, I
something.
mean, I
It's a
think
big step for us.
it's huge, and I think transparency and accountability is a big piece of what needs to go into whatever role that member would play or that board position would need to be created to do.
I think that's all part of the discussion. I mean, the authority was established under a city ordinance, so we'd have to look at, whether it's that ordinance or whether it's just the bylaws of the authority that need to be amended. to change the board. We do have, the city of Des Moines does have an ex officio member on the board right now. Matt Anderson sits on our board meetings, doesn't have voting power, but is an ex officio member. That's an option potentially for the county as well. I think if we would, we just need to investigate the different options and see where that takes us.
Well, the way I look at it, you got, let's see, our schedule right now is we're gonna have a public meeting with comment on September 5th. And then the board, will again take public comment on September 19th, and we were planning to vote, I think, on that day.
Yes.
To have a resolution. So
Yeah.
I'd like to have some kind of assurance
Okay,
from the city that we play some role.
we can have those discussions. I will say, even if the referendum passes, that doesn't mean the debt is going to get issued. So.
Oh, I realize that.
So if it's not, if we don't have the loan agreement and all the terms worked out by September 19th, is my point, if the supervisors are willing, the referendum can move forward. Even if the referendum passes, the debt, you still have to vote to pass vote to,
Voters have to vote on it in November, and
Right.
then we got a ways to go before we issue debt.
right,
I got it. I'm just letting you know that you got a ways to work with the city of Des Moines to have us have some kind of say on the International Airport Board, if we're gonna move forward by issuing you debt. It's a big step for us to do a $350 million debt, and we lose our bond by a point, or an A, or whatever the hell it is.
yep, understood. We'll look at the options, and Kevin will talk with our board and figure out what directions we will go.
I'm all for it, believe me, I think it's the biggest economic thing that the Board of Supervisors can do. And I'll be 100% behind the referendum. But I do think if we take this step, that the board should have some say on that board. That's my 2 cents.
On the funding sources and uses, the whole combination totals $508 million, and the airport authority has moved forward with the terminal phase 1 and approved that. You're still showing a funding balance of $69 million that needs to be identified through all the various means that you discussed as ways of getting that $69 million. I guess my question is in light of what the authority has already done and the assumptions that you made in terms of your borrowing, did you assume that you would be borrowing at market rate or
Yep.
did you, or going the geo route?
Well, I've done kind of a sensitivity analysis on multiple rates. Our base case was a 5% rate.
Okay,
A number of airports have issued debt recently, and I continue to track that. Most recently, granted they're larger, Atlanta, DFW, Asheville, North Carolina recently issued debt. They're another one that I've been tracking because they're more similar to Des Moines in size. So the 5% was our base case, and that's where the market seems to be now.
okay. And going the geo route, what is that going to be based on today's rate?
Well, I had in my slides, I think it's at least a 60 basis point improvement over what we could bond at.
Okay,
I can't promise what the market's going to be next summer, but generally there's going to be a gap, a spread between what we would bond at, which is probably going to be an A or possibly A1 with Moody's, versus AAA or even AA.
okay,
If the county gets knocked down a notch to AA3, then there's still going to be a pretty good spread between what we could borrow at and what the county could borrow at.
okay.
The actual percentage, that's just based on the market. at the time. And like I said, our base case in the modeling has been 5%. We've modeled 4% and 6% as well, to figure out what the difference is.
Okay.
So, I mean, I'm comfortable there's going to be a significant spread for the county to borrow and loan it to the authority in terms of debt service savings.
Yeah. Thank you.
I guess and the other biggest thing that accomplishes is you get it done a lot quicker. I mean, to have this bonding capacity that
We repay the debt quicker.
right. And construction could move forward instead of all these phases that you were gonna do,
No, I mean, we're still gonna do phase 1A.
okay?
This does make the potential to get more of phase 1B completed better, because the total debt service, if we go out and borrow the $350 million ourselves, the total debt service is gonna be somewhere in the neighborhood of $700 million over the time we repay it. So this $70 million savings that Tim talked about really comes off that. We're essentially saving 10% of the debt service over the life of the debt.
So the timeline of the airport, which I've told people I thought we were saving also,
The timeline's,
really true?
no, timeline's pretty much the same, because we're gonna proceed with the construction. This is really about the lowest cost of capital for, reducing the cost of capital for the airport. So theoretically, we save 70 million on this debt service. That's 70 million we have to put towards phase 1B. It
Okay.
could speed up phase 1B. It's not necessarily gonna change the timeline on phase 1A.
And who's going to be responsible for selling the referendum to the public? And how's that process how's that going to play out? I assume we'll do some surveys and polling and,
Yep, the airport authority has hired a consultant to help us with that, and we will initiate some polling to figure out where we stand with the public. From the results of that, then we'll decide what education efforts are needed. We obviously can't advocate for that as a public entity, but we can certainly inform the public of the benefits of this path.
who would be the face of the campaign?
We've talked to Tom Mahoney, former chair of
ITA.
ITA Group.
Yeah.
And Tom has agreed to help us out because he's very much a proponent of this project. So I think we've got a good chair there that will really help us out.
Pretty
Great.
good.
You bet.
We know we can't say anything,
Right.
of course.
Well, I'll just say
It
this, I think Angela's right. I think the economic impact that we're talking about here, of all the things we're talking about right now, this is the number one thing. There's a reason Kansas City put $1 billion into a new airport here recently. It wasn't because Chili's needed a new place to open a restaurant. There's economic development that goes along with airports, and this would be an economic impact that would apply across, just not the Des Moines Metro, but the entire state of Iowa. So I think this really makes a lot of sense. I mean, the numbers add up to me. I think the difficulty, not to the extent it's ever a difficulty, is explaining to the public how this does make sense. I mean, $70 million is a lot of money, and, I think that's, if it doesn't affect them either way on their property taxes, I think he's got a good chance of passing. But getting the message out will be the difficulty, but it always is in these kind of things.
And the clock is ticking.
Right.
Understood. And we, as soon as the referendum is voted for, we will aggressively proceed down that path to inform the public.
And we'll begin that public comment process, our next meeting on the 5th.
Yeah.
Next Tuesday. That will be an item on our agenda, giving people in Polk County an opportunity to comment on us moving this forward, and that will be publicized in our agenda. And based on that, then we'll make the decision and input from you to move forward on September 19th as an item on our agenda to approve moving the referendum forward. You heard from everyone, we do have not necessarily concerns, but we have some requests.
Sure.
And I think the biggest one is we do need to have some type of representation with the board and with our $350 million, it's an investment. And I say this a little tongue-in-cheek, but we don't want to own an airport. So, it's serious that we do this referendum and put this bond together correctly. So, Brian, thank you. Tim, as always, thank you.
Yeah, thanks much.
Yeah,
Appreciate the opportunity to be here and.
very
all
well
your
done
input.
presentation. I mean, you
Good job.
You did a great job, so thank you very much. If you move this forward as you're presenting it now, I believe it's going forward. So thanks so much.
Thank you all.
With that, we're adjourned.
Thanks.